Okay, so my name is Alex Gardner. I'm the DA, and to my immediate right is Andy Kenyon. Andy is a detective sergeant with the Oregon State Police, and to his right is Dusty Sprague. Dusty is also with the Oregon State Police. He's the lead detective on this case. I've already provided a written release, and in the interest of getting you all out of here sooner, I'm not going to add much to that. I just want to emphasize that the piece of this case that we look at for the DA's office is the situation immediately surrounding the officer's decision to shoot. And in this case, the officer who was extended up through the roof hatch, and the purpose for that was getting the best possible view of the front door of Mr. Babb's house. When Mr. Babb brought the rifle to bear on him so that the officer could actually see the hole in the end of the barrel, the officer fired. And I know what most people have wanted to talk about is the circumstances that preceded the officer being in that situation. And unfortunately, I'm not, that's sort of beyond the scope of our inquiry. We've collected the information, but that's not something that I should be commenting on. So with that, what I'd like to do is turn this over to the detectives so that they can give you a very brief summary overview, and then if you have questions, we'll do our best to answer them.
Can we move yeah. And do you mind before you're starting saying and spelling your name for us? So that would be thanks.
Linda, we're gonna be switching over here. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So my name is Sergeant Andy Kenyon. I'm with the State Police. I'm in charge of the Interagency Deadly Force Investigation Team. The spelling of my name is Andy, Kenyon. This is Detective Dusty Sprague, who's also with the State Police and was the lead investigator for that investigation. His last name is spelled Sprague. We'll just briefly go over what we discovered during our investigation on March 30th when the EdFit team responded to the shooting. And that's that at approximately 5:06 p.m. on the 30th, Eugene Police Department received a 911 phone call from a counselor who advised that she was working with a client who was a veteran from Afghanistan who had suffered PTSD as well as a severe traumatic brain injury, and that client was in crisis at the time, and had told her that he had armed himself with a 9mm pistol and had actually fired the weapon inside the house, and had also made threats of harming himself. That information was relayed to 911, and officers responded for a welfare check at the address of 2248 DeVos Street. When officers arrived on scene, which is approximately 5:13 p.m., the officers could see that tactically this was a fairly dangerous situation for them to try to walk into. Some of these pictures to the right kind of demonstrate what it was that the officers could see. This picture to the far right shows the driveway as you face back towards the residence. The residence is only partially seen here because it sits back behind all the other houses. So as officers responded to this location and more information was learned about the danger of Mr. Babb inside the home, having a gun, having fired a shot, and there possibly being a roommate also inside the house, it was determined that probably the safest way to approach the house was to use an armored vehicle so that officers could actually get closer to the residence, put eyes on the residence. At approximately 5:40 p.m., the armored vehicle arrived on scene and was parked in a driveway next to the residence. And within that armored vehicle was also a crisis negotiator from the SWAT team who started loud hailing using the PA system to make contact with Mr. Babb inside the residence. They made several attempts to encourage Mr. Babb to exit the residence. There was no success with those attempts. At approximately 5:43 p.m., the roommate that was living in the residence with Mr. Babb exited the residence and was immediately brought to the armored vehicle, which was close by, so that those officers could interview him quickly and determine what the situation inside the residence was. They learned from the roommate that Mr. Babb was inside the residence attempting to open a large safe that had several high-powered rifles and other firearms in the safe. There was a lot of discussion at that point as far as trying to determine what the best way to reach a peaceful solution or outcome to this event was. Part of that discussion was whether or not we could extend the perimeter and that the officers could actually back up and try to de-escalate the situation. Contact was made with Mr. Babb via telephone with the crisis negotiator. Mr. Babb ended that conversation by hanging up the phone, and shortly after that, at approximately 5:52, the officer who was in the top hatch of that armored vehicle, who had a view of a portion of the top of the front door, which, if you can look, this picture here demonstrates basically the view from inside the armored vehicle. The armored vehicle has a video camera that points out the front that's just to the right of the driver. So this is a little bit lower, approximately 18 inches lower than the view that the officer in the top hatch would have of the front door. The officer who was watching the front door from the top hatch observed a male subject come to the front door and shoulder a rifle and pointed at him, and at that point realized that his only option to defend himself was to stop the threat, which he did. He fired one shot. Mr. Babb dropped out of sight and was no longer visible because of the fences that are in front of the house. There was a lot of discussion at that point as far as the officers trying to determine in that dynamic situation if that was a shot fired by the subject inside the house or if that was a shot fired by the officer. Approximately 4 minutes later, they determined that nobody had a view on Mr. Babb, so they were unsure if he was actually injured, if he had ducked out of sight, and so, or if he was maybe moving to a different position in the house. So they approached the house in that armored vehicle by driving through those fences, and as they arrived in front of the house, they observed Mr. Babb lying in the doorway, and that rifle that he had been pointing was laying on the front porch. Officers immediately responded to Mr. Babb and determined that he was deceased. Medics were called to respond who had been staged nearby. Those medics responded immediately and confirmed that Mr. Babb was deceased. At that point, the entire scene was secured and all the officers involved were interviewed as it fit. The investigators responded to the scene to interview officers and witnesses and conduct a neighborhood canvass and talk to all the neighbors that were in the area as well. All that information from neighbors, witnesses, officers, the involved shooting officer, any video recordings, all that information was collected by the IDFIT team and provided to Alex Gardner, and that's what he used to make his decision. Is there anything I'm leaving out, Dusty?
No, that's-
Okay. So if you have specific questions, anything that I can answer?
Where was Brian Babb hit exactly?
He was hit in the lower left portion of his face.
Yes, the bullet struck the left cheek and exited just to the right of the spine around C2 or C3.
So I just got done talking with the family, and they mentioned that there's some discrepancies between who actually saw Brian. Can you just go over that? She was mentioning that she was told that the officer coming out of the hatch was the only person that saw Brian, but then there was also a story that was told to her that the driver inside the armored car also saw Brian at the doorway.
Correct. There was actually, based on all the interviews, there were 2 officers that saw Brian. And It's kind of difficult to demonstrate. This image is actually a 3D scan that would be looking out of the upper bedroom windows of Mr. Babb's residence and facing out towards DeVos Street to the east. There was officers posted. There was an officer on the top of this roof here, and then officers posted in the perimeter locations out around. But as you can see, there's a large fifth wheel truck, fences. There were several items that were blocking the clear view to the front door, which would have been over in this area here. The only two individuals that actually saw Mr. Babb come to the front door was the operator of the armored vehicle and Officer Stutzman, who was in the top hatch. And they both gave statements that were consistent with what their observations were, that Mr. Babb came to the front door with a large rifle that was scoped and pointed that rifle.
Do you mind going back to the other photo that you had before that? All right. So their claim is that you can't see over the fence, so that the driver wouldn't be able to actually see that, if that's where the...
Can you see the door on the other side of the fence? Yeah. this-
Relatively, I mean, I guess I can see ahead, I guess, right?
Right. So I guess there are 2 points. The first is that what you're seeing now is from inside the armored vehicle, and for the officer who fired, he was actually up, extended above through the hatch. So that extra maybe 18 inches or so gave him a little bit better view. The second thing that's important to note is that that's sort of evidence that the gun must have been shouldered or held high, right? Because if it was held down low, it would have been blocked by the fence. So it sort of underscores the point. The third thing that I'd mention is that there's video running inside the armored vehicle. So when the decision is made to go forward and it goes through the fence and actually up to the area of the front porch, you can see the rifles there on the porch, and it's continuous video. So there's no question about whether he actually had the gun.
So you're saying that the driver would have been a little bit higher too?
I'm saying that the person the shooter who was extended up through the hatch could see it. The driver's position is approximately what you're seeing through this video. I can't say exactly where his eyes were relative to the in-car video camera, but it's going to be very close. And he can see a significant portion of that doorway. I don't know. I guesstimated at 20%, but it looks like maybe 18 inches or 2 feet, something like that.
Alex, you said, one of the reasons why we're having this conference is because we want to be transparent with this case. You said there was persistent publicity of factually incorrect information. What incorrect information was out there?
Lots. So I've been told that this was an initial SWAT response. The fact is it was a patrol response, and then SWAT was brought in when there were concerns that merited it. I've been told by one alleged bystander that the person who was shot was actually a SWAT sniper on a neighboring roof. That's inaccurate. There are lots of these little factual inaccuracies that are obviously designed by people to create the appearance of police action that didn't take place, to make it look like there wasn't restraint. So I think it's important to set the record straight.
Can you talk about, do you know from the time that the armored vehicle arrived at 5:40, how long it took the officers to get on the loudspeaker?
I can speak to that. I don't have the actual time of the, at least in my notes here, of the armored vehicle arriving. 5:40 p.m. was the beginning of when officers began to use the loudspeaker.
Okay. And can you elaborate in terms of what kind of communication was going on between the officers on the scene and the information that they were receiving from the therapist who was on the phone, both with Brian Babb and with the 911 dispatcher? She indicated in her op-ed piece that, you know, there was basically the information was fed real time, and she had indicated and stressed to them that Brian had unloaded the gun, the handgun that he had in his possession. But I'm just curious, in terms of your investigation, what information did you get from the officers about the information that they're receiving about that?
I would have to say that there was updated information being provided. I think there is a level of inaccuracy as far as the information being relayed about the weapons being unloaded.
In terms of officers weren't aware of that?
In terms that there was a lot more information being provided than just the weapon being unloaded. There was discussion of questioning whether he'd removed a clip from the weapon, which he also discussed how quickly he could reload the weapon.
So in your view then, there appeared to be some information about the weapon being unloaded, but there was also information that indicated that it was kind of a tenuous situation.
Yes.
Is any portion of the video from the armored vehicle going to be released, maybe up until the point where he's shot?
Yeah, I mean, my expectation is that it will all be released. It's a matter of timing now, so it's a lot of information to process, and this actually, this is a bunch of DVDs that contains the content of the reports. So we're doing what we can to quickly redact. We're trying to take the privacy information out, phone numbers and addresses, and to the extent that they're in their social security numbers, that sort of stuff. But the content will be there, and I think you'll have access ultimately to the recordings, everything except for maybe portions of the therapist interview, which would continue to be protected.
The officer's use of deadly force.
Can you come closer, Alex, to the
I could,
table?
Lauren, but then you'd be able to hear me.
I'll wait till whoever asks this question to move the mic, but the use of deadly force by the officer was consistent with the requirements of Oregon law. Can you be more specific in what that means?
Yeah, I'm not trying to hide the ball. I'm trying to make it clear
Hold
that.
on a second, we need to do that again.
Sorry.
A second.
Sorry.
Nope, no worries, I
Thank
just
you.
don't.
Sure.
I want to see you. Okay.
I'm trying to make it clear that there's no broader judgment about the overall circumstance. But I'm at the same time trying to make it clear that the officer who chose to shoot had no reasonable, viable alternative under the circumstances. I hope that's clear enough.
So when the gun goes up, officers are trained to protect themselves.
If there's reason to believe that somebody is at risk of being seriously injured or killed, and yes, that's the response. Yeah, I mean, people have asked, why didn't the officer duck down into the armored vehicle, for example, and that just reflects a lack of understanding of the way these things unfold in real life and the extent of the officer's responsibility. I mean, obviously he's concerned for his personal safety, but he's also concerned for the safety of the other people. And at that instant, when the barrel is brought to bear and you can see the hole in the end of it, firing is the unfortunate necessity.
Thanks for explaining that.
Sure.
How many times did the crisis negotiator call out on the loudspeaker system, and can you provide details in terms of how long and what was the content of the brief conversation between the crisis negotiator and Mr. Babb?
The attempts to call Mr. Babb out of the home began at 5:40 p.m. The types of things that were being said is, we want to keep you safe, we want to make sure that everybody is safe, and we can only do that if you come out of your home with your hands empty and in the air. At 5:43 p.m. is
Hold on a
when...
second. Say that again, please.
At 5:43 p.m. is when the roommate comes out of the home. And at 5:52 p.m. is when the shot is fired.
Do
you know how many times the crisis negotiator communicated through the loudspeaker system?
I believe it's 7 times.
That sounds right, that's mine.
And do you have more detail in terms of, it sounds like there was a connection made via phone between the crisis negotiator and Mr. Babb. What was transpired? What was talked about? I mean, how long did that last?
Do you recall that, sir?
I don't recall exactly. I'm looking up right now in the notes. It was a very brief conversation, and the crisis negotiator basically had a short period to explain we're trying to reach a peaceful resolution to this, and asked him to come out. And Mr. Babb was extremely angry and used profanity and then hung up the phone.
Other questions?
I had one that's kind of more general. You know, we're operating in an environment now in this nation where there's a lot of questions about deadly use of force by police officers.
Can we
Just
move the
look at-
microphone again, please? Sorry to interrupt you guys.
Sorry, we'll try and remember.
Thanks.
We're trainable, right?
Yeah, ish. Oops.
Sorry to
That's
interrupt you,
good.
go ahead.
There's you know, obviously a lot of attention on officers' use of force around the nation right now. You just gotta look at what's going on with Baltimore. And I'm just wondering, do you have any comments in terms of what would you say to people who might be, you know, well, I don't necessarily believe this, I don't think this information is accurate. They're basically questioning the information provided here, because a lot of that's going around in this country right now, and I'm just wondering if you had any comment about your response to that hesitancy or disbelief.
I have a lot of comments, Christian. I should start taking any moment now. We are not Ferguson. It's one of the unfortunate comparisons. I've seen some of the videotape, and I've read much of the reporting on a number of the incidents out east. And the extent to which we are different from that is enormous. And there's not much I can do to address people's unspecified fears that have nothing to do with our actual performance here. But the evidence in this case is consistent. And for example, as to those people who would say that he never had a gun or he didn't come to the door with a gun, the video inside the armored vehicle is running continuously. So you can see it from the moment all the way up to the door, and there's the gun. So the police would never have had an opportunity to plant it there. So I guess what I would say, Christian, is it would be really helpful if the people who are conspiracy theorists would discipline themselves to work through the evidence as we do. Nobody here would say that police aren't fallible. We're all fallible. But we need to be judged, our system needs to be judged on the content of our performance, not based on the misdeeds of people on the other side of the country. Other questions?
What's the next step in the process? I mean, I know this is the preliminary kind of
Right.
report. What happens next?
The next step is actually much more challenging and broader, because the shooting review board will review it, and that they will look from beginning to end, and the police agency, the EPD, is the one that will be able to give you the details on that. But I understand from talking to the chief that he's very interested in allowing facilitating robust conversation about what, if anything, the system can do better. It's not a question of whether this officer behaved as well as he could under the circumstances. The question is there anything that the system can do better? And I think everybody's invested in that conversation.
Do you think that it was unusual for the therapist to write an op-ed piece for the order disregard?
All I can say is I haven't seen that before, but she's a very nice woman, obviously cared deeply for Mr. Babb and is very much invested in seeing our system do whatever is possible to minimize the chance of another veteran dying this way. And she has that in common with everybody in the law enforcement system. Nobody feels good about this sort of a tragedy. So if there's something the system can do, either by having more robust mental health services for veterans or anything else, we're going to be delighted to see it.
I may be, second to this question. I'm sure it's going to be asked again by someone else. Any opportunity to use a less lethal round or, some kind of less lethal force other than shooting Mr. Babb?
I guess the short answer is no. And I hasten to say I've worked a lot of these, and I've seen EPD use less than lethal lots and lots of times. And where it's appropriate under the circumstances, they would prefer to use that. Any police agency here would. So, but less than lethal is not brought to bear in a situation where a high-powered rifle's pointed at your head. That's not the way it works.
But officers did have those tools on scene, and were considering that if the event allowed that opportunity, that would have been an option. Unfortunately, like Alex said, that was not an option when he stepped out with a rifle.
One of the things that people have also asked is, why the hurry? Why the short period of time between when the police got there and the shot? And the answer is that's driven by the person on the other side of the police. It's always driven by that person. So where we have lengthy hostage situations, we've had many of them, that's because the people who are on the inside, who are running the hostage situation, don't force the matter.